Dozens of children are killed in airstrikes in Yemen. But amid the outrage and calls for investigations, broader questions loom. What is the international community's role in this war, and what can be done to stop it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hoda Abdel-Hamid. Yemen is routinely called the world's worst humanitarian crisis, but sometimes an individual event can bring that phrase starkly into focus. That's what happened on Thursday when a series of airstrikes in the northern province of Saada killed dozens of people, most of them schoolchildren. Even by Yemen standards, it was shocking, and it once again called attention to foreign involvement in the war. That not only means the Saudi and Emirati forces leading the coalition fighting the Houthis, but also the Western governments that sell them weapons and offer logistical support. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Mohammed Ado in Djibouti.
Still wearing his backpack, this boy was in a minibus full of children heading back from a school summer camp in northern Yemen. But as their bus drove through a busy area of Dahyan town in Saada province, it was targeted by airstrikes. Rescue workers bring in injured children one after another. Overwhelmed medical workers treat the injured on the corridors and every available space in the hospital. Houthi fighters have accused the Saudi Emirati-led coalition of launching the attack.
The Saudi-led coalition attacked a bus carrying more than 30 students who were on a summer school trip to the city. There's no exact number of the dead people. The hospital has received many wounded with a lot of serious injuries.
This boy refuses to have his injuries treated till he sees his brothers who were with him on the bus.
No, I need my brothers. I won't get help until I see my brothers.
The strike happened during morning rush hour in the busy market. A huge crater lies in the middle of the road, the exact spot where the missile fell. The mangled wreckage of the school bus the children were traveling in, now trapped under the destroyed market buildings. Learning materials belonging to the children are strewn around, eerie reminders of the attack and the frenzied struggle to leave the scene by those lucky enough to escape unhurt. In a statement, the Saudi Emirati coalition said its airstrikes in Saada were aimed at missile launchers used to attack an industrial city in southern Saudi Arabia on Wednesday. The statement further accused the Houthi fighters of using children as human shields. There are increasing calls for investigations into these attacks.
We've seen those reports. It's very important, as we've said repeatedly, that all parties to the conflict in Yemen adhere to international humanitarian law. Where there is an incident of this sort, it's important that it's investigated thoroughly and that the conclusions of that investigation are shared and are learnt from, and we'll be calling for that in this instance as well.
Saudi Arabia and its allies have been fighting in Yemen for more than 3 years against the Houthis, who are aligned with Iran. The Houthis control much of northern Yemen, including the capital Sana'a. This latest attack adds more casualties to the list of thousands who've been killed during this war. The UN calls it the world's worst humanitarian crisis. In recent months, Saudi and UAE forces have advanced towards the port city of Hoda, which is under the control of Houthi fighters. Most aid and food to Yemen gets in through this port. In response, Houthi fighters have intensified attacks against Saudi and Emirati targets. Mohammed Ado, Al Jazeera, Djibouti.
Let's take a closer look at the conflict in Yemen, which began in 2014 when Houthi rebels took control of northern provinces and eventually the capital Sana'a. The government led by Abdel-Rabbu Mansour Hadi was forced to flee south, setting up a provincial capital in the port city of Aden. In 2015, a coalition led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates began fighting the Houthis. It also blockaded the country in an effort to cut off Iranian support for Houthi rebels. Tens of thousands of people have been killed and millions more displaced. Aid agencies now say a third of the country is on the brink of famine. let's bring in our guests. They're all joining us on Skype. From Doncaster in the UK, Simon Mabon, lecturer in international relations at Lancaster University. And in Sana'a, Hakim El-Mesmeri, editor-in-chief and publisher of the Yemen Post. And in Stockholm, Pieter Wezeman, a senior researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. Hakim El-Mesmeri, let me start with you. How do Yemenis react when they hear about calls for investigations, whether it's by the UN, indeed lately by the Saudi-led coalition, or by the Pentagon? Who do they blame, actually? Do they need an investigation?
There is no need for an investigation because the coalition forces have admitted for standing behind this attack. I'm surprised why the UN is calling for an investigation rather than calling for those who are responsible for this attack to be held accountable for it. So this is one of the reasons why Yemenis have lost hope on the international community, on the UN, over 2 years ago, because of this war that has not been for any other reason, only for a proxy war between two neighboring countries, between Saudi and Iran, where Yemen is paying the price. And in yesterday's attack, you have 51 civilians who were killed, and 40 of them who were children who were just going to school, summer school, and were stopping by in a local market when that's where their death came to them. And the body parts, the corpse of all the children, those who were killed and those who were being treated, the parents right now, the entire country is mourning these innocent children who were killed just for the reason of going to school or on their way to school.
Well, Pieter, you know, the Pentagon said it didn't know whether the bombs used in yesterday's attack, for example, were US made. It also didn't know if actually it refueled the planes going on their mission or coming back from their mission. But does that absolve the role of the US in what is happening on the ground?
It is very clear that the US is the key supplier of weapons to at least Saudi Arabia and also to the Emirates. It may very well be that in this particular instance, it was not US bombs or US planes which were involved. But of course, if you are the main supplier, you do know that there is a very big chance that it will be your bombs and your planes which were involved. And on top of this comes, of course, also that the US has said that by actually supplying arms to countries like Saudi Arabia, they believe they can have some sort of leverage and some sort of influence and can even give them support in actually choosing the right targets. If you then have to fight a war in Yemen, then at least choose military targets to hit. And this is where the United States and also Great Britain have said that they can be of support. In this case, it seems that they have completely failed. So the question if they have a certain responsibility here is certainly a legitimate one.
So, Simon, I mean, it does sound that, you know, the US is merely running a gas station in the air, but looking closer at it, it is providing logistical support, it is providing ammunition. So is there any mechanism by which it can be also held accountable for the war in Yemen in general, and specifically when such atrocities happen?
Well, I think it's a very expensive gas station that it's running there. So let's not forget that the US and UK combined have sold around $12 billion worth of weapons to the Saudis, whose weaponry is being used in this campaign, with over 100,000 missiles being launched and sorties being launched on the Yemeni streets. So this is huge. There are a huge number of opportunities that can be explored if there is the desire to take things forward in terms of the United Nations, but also in terms of international law. But this is where it gets incredibly ambiguous and incredibly problematic, because that's where the political agendas really start to come to the fore. We've seen at the United Nations, the United Kingdom is the penholder with regard to Yemen, which technically means that it's responsible for putting these motions forward. But we've seen that in spite of widespread acknowledgement that Yemen is facing all kinds of humanitarian crises, with over 22 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, the UK and US have been somewhat reticent of actually doing anything on the world stage. So I think they're complicit in a range of different ways.
And what would be those ways for you, just briefly?
Sure. Well, we see obviously the sale of weapons to Saudi Arabia. We know that UK officials have been sitting in on some of the missions that Saudi planes have launched over Yemen in terms of Sky reports and ITV reports in the UK. We know that there are allegations that the UK is complicit in terms of weapons that have been sold, as well as the political, economic, logistical, and military support that it's given to Saudi Arabia. But then also there's the moral and the ethical dimensions of not doing what they should supposed to be doing at the United Nations. And I think that reveals the broader geopolitical tensions that are at play here, with the two states providing a great deal of cover for the actions of Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman in particular.
Pieter, at the end of the day, investigations come and go, but do they really change anything on the ground? And do they really change how the world functions, or not?
Of course, an investigation may provide clearer evidence of what actually happened. It may provide us a clearer picture to which extent the Saudi-led coalition did make a proper effort to avoid civilian casualties, even if they completely failed in this particular case and in a number of other cases before. Hopefully that could then lead to some more countries adding to those which have decided to take certain action towards Saudi Arabia, in particular when it comes to arms supplies, to be more restricted or even have unilateral arms embargoes. This may happen. It may also happen that the US potentially could be more willing to be more restrictive, to have more major demands towards Saudi Arabia, or to help Saudi Arabia to wage a war which is, at least in terms of international humanitarian law, more into line what can be expected and what is expected of states. But of course, this is not going to make the big difference here. I think that's a much longer process in which those countries, which are the main suppliers, could take up much more responsibility in putting pressure on Saudi Arabia and the UAE to seek a political solution to this conflict, because it's not just about the violations of international humanitarian law. It's also the fact that trying to fight this war in Yemen is by many considered as a rather hopeless case. You're not going to win this war with military means.
So just going to our question, are Yemenis aware of the involvement or the role of the certain Western powers when it comes to the war that's been waged on their country?
Yemenis are convinced of one thing, is that because it's a poor country, their voice is not being heard. When the rich fights the poor, the voices of the poor are always ignored, even if you are oppressed. They know that the Saudi and its allies have the wealth. They're persuading these Western countries to buy their weapons, financial interests, to improve their economies. So even if that's on the cost of Yemeni civilians, the 40 children who were killed yesterday are only a small portion of the 3,000 plus children killed over the last 3 years of war. And these are innocent school children who were killed by random airstrikes on supposedly military targets, while some of these targets were schools and hospitals. So because Yemen is poor, the whole world is ignoring them and taking the interests of the strong countries and powerful countries. For example, another example why these calls for investigations, or the UN or Western powers calls for human rights, etc., are baseless or not enough. Sana'a airport has been closed for over 2 years, and this has resulted in the death of 12,000 children in Yemen who needed medical attention abroad but could not leave the country. The world is ignoring them because, again, it's a poor country fighting a rich country where the international community, especially the West, is gaining financial interest and having the Yemenis suffer for that.
Simon, does Hakeem have a point there that sometimes when it comes to specifically Saudi Arabia and to a lesser extent the Emirates, Western countries shy away from openly criticizing, also because sometimes the response from Saudi can be quite harsh. We've seen that lately, for example, with the spat with Canada. Do you think that's playing into this whole situation?
I think it's certainly a calculation. I'm not sure that it's just about a worry about the Saudi response, but I think in the case of the UK in particular, there's a real concern about the economic implications of a fracturing in the relationship between London and Riyadh. So we've seen the sheer amount of money that has been spent from the Saudis coming into the British economy in terms of arms and the manufacturing of all kinds of military equipment that is being sold to the Saudis. And that, of course, for the UK in times when we're unsure about the economic future of the country, when we're unsure, we're in the midst of the Brexit process, the Saudi money coming in is actually a real source of positive development and positive wealth for the country. So no prime minister is going to try and jeopardize that for the sake of human rights across the world. And that, unfortunately, is the reality of realpolitik, no matter how much we are vocal in criticizing it. And I, of course, have been very critical of such positions, but that is the reality of politics in the UK at present, that normative concerns, humanitarian interests are being sacrificed on the altar of realpolitik.
And Pieter, the same situation is with the US, I would say, in the sense that since the Trump administration came into place, certainly the military assistance to the Saudis has expanded when at a time just after Obama had actually stopped the sales of weapons. Now, is that because when President Trump went to Saudi Arabia, he got this grandiose welcome and he got pledges of billions of dollars in contract? Or what is the reasoning behind all of that? Is it simply money talk?
Money talks, certainly, although I have to add immediately that this was also the case under the Obama administration. Obama or his administration did put certain restrictions on certain arms sales to Saudi Arabia, but most of them just continued as they were. It looks as if they had somewhat higher demands, as if they were looking at possibilities to put more pressure on the Saudis so that they would kind of behave better in Yemen. But overall, even though potentially arms exports to Saudi Arabia under Trump may increase even further than the very high levels they were already under the Obama administration, I don't think the change is that enormous. But still, in a number of cases, Trump has made very clear that he's not interested in any restrictions on Saudi Arabia at all. One of the recent changes, for example, in US arms exports policy was to say that Saudi Arabia now also can get certain types of military drones, maybe even armed drones. And one of the arguments was there that if the US would not supply them, then actually China would do so, and China had already done so. So there are a whole range of reasons why this is the case. We also have to look at the fact that in reality, arms sales may not necessarily be so enormous in economic terms, but if you stop arms sales, then you give a signal to Saudi Arabia, and the risk is that Saudi Arabia will react with anger to that. And as we can see in the case of Canada, will also pull out of so many more and most likely much more lucrative economic activities in the country, which would impose some sort of arms embargo or restrictions on Saudi Arabia. At least that can happen, doesn't have to happen. I immediately also say that Germany has made very clear that it is no longer willing to supply arms to Saudi Arabia, and the effects until now on the German economy or in the relations between Germany and Saudi Arabia seem to be relatively limited. So it doesn't have to happen, this kind of enormous clash with Saudi Arabia, if you pull out or criticize.
So, Hakim, from your vantage point, I know the bombs are being dropped by the coalition, but do you hold all these countries who either provide weapons or logistical support or even surveillance information? Do you hold them as responsible as the Saudi-led coalition for the suffering of the Yemeni people?
As you mentioned, it's not one country, it's a coalition. So they're all helping one way or the other, and they're all helping in spilling the Yemeni blood. And again, if those who were killed were Houthi fighters, then that would be the act of war, where their fighters are killing each other. But to have civilians pay the price, this is what hurts the Yemeni people, or all those who are passionate throughout the world. When civilians are paying the price for a dirty war that they have nothing to do with, they're suffering, they're sleeping hungry, they are sleeping and worrying that they would not wake up alive. They have their children crying at night from hunger, and with that, they are killed by airstrikes because they're ordinary civilians and because they were not able to be a rich country where Yemen would be important to the world, or give the world some financial interest to help them become allies. So because it's not that you have allies by your stand. Allies today are bought by money and not by their stand on human rights or on democracy.
Okay, Simon, Amnesty International, for example, has issued a report in which it detailed what it called were war crimes carried out on the ground. For example, secret detention centers by the UAE. They talk about widespread torture, and there's a long list. To what extent selling weapons or providing logistical support makes you complicit to what is happening on the ground?
I think that's a really interesting philosophical question that could have a whole program of its own. And some of my colleagues in Lancaster teach courses on the ethics of such decisions. But I think that for the people of the Yemen, it doesn't really matter how complicit the US or the UK is. They are involved. They are providing weapons. They are providing this support, and that is helping kill their children, their friends, their families. And I would argue that they are complicit for all manner of reasons. We know that British officials are sitting in rooms with Saudi counterparts, making decisions on what are legitimate and what are illegitimate targets according to their own calculations. Now, if the UK and the US and other Western powers wanted to do something more positive, then they should look to the UN and try and get a better resolution than 2216, which is incredibly restrictive, which has deadlocked the country in a conflict that has very little chance of actually moving forward, because the parties involved in the conflict are not given space to actually have their grievances addressed, or indeed given the space to actually come to the table and talk without some incredibly limiting conditions. So I think if there is a real desire to move towards getting a resolution to the Yemeni conflict, that is what must happen alongside all of these investigations that will hold people to account.
And I'll give the last word to Hakeem. Have Yemenis just lost all hope that anyone will come and help them out to get out of this incredibly complicated situation? Or, as you said earlier, they know that being the poorest country in the region, they are the ones that count the less?
Let's be honest. Yes, I'm a bit pessimistic, but there are some positive issues going on. The UN envoy is currently doing a very good job and serious job to try to end this war in Yemen, and that could help to a limit. But if there is no international will to end this war, it will not end. By Yemeni efforts or by international or UN efforts, there has to be a will to end this war. There has to be a will to end the sufferings of 26 million people in the poorest country in the world. Last year, we heard of Yemen being the worst humanitarian crisis in 50 years. And since then, over 1,500 civilians have been killed by the war, and not to mention over 40,000 killed by hunger or due to medical reasons for sicknesses they were able to get cure or treatment for. No one cares, and because of the Yemen being a poor country. But I do feel that the international community will start pushing to an extent. It needs to be a push to help end the sufferings of Yemen. And as you previously have said, the UN resolution needs to be more lenient because it's the cause for this war. Because right now, around a different case. It's a different scenario. You have different powers on the ground comparing to
which was the case when this resolution took place.
A
3 years
very
ago.
sad situation indeed, but we have reached the end of the program. So thank you very much to all our guests, Simon Mabon, Hakim El-Masmari, and Pieter Wezeman. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hoda Abdel-Hamid, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.